Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. It is my immense pleasure to have George Will on today, who is like the Michael Jordan of writing. He's a columnist at the Washington Post, and I think he's the most published person in media outlets other than, I'm pretty sure, the Peanut character from the Charlie Brown cartoon, which is amazing. It's insane how influential he is. He's also known for his love of baseball, which is among some of the topics that we'll be talking about today. Thank you so much and welcome.
Glad to be with you.
So, before we start, I want to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
The essence of conservatism is the understanding that nothing lasts. Nothing. Not nations, not regimes. The continents themselves are even drifting and the tectonic plates move around. So I think the most important thing for young people to internalize is the impermanence and contingency of almost everything.
Good response. That leads us right in to what we're going to be talking about today, which is how you are the leading voice for conservatism. And your latest book is called The Conservative Sensibility. So, what do you mean by conservatism?
Well, I mean, in the American context, and it's important to understand that in the phrase American conservatism, the adjective American does a lot of work on the noun conservatism. Conservatism in Europe grew up in defense of stability in the established hierarchical societies. Blood and soil, throne and altar, the resistance of ferment in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century. Conservatism in the United States is strikingly different. Conservatives in the United States embrace what the great economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Conservatives in the United States embrace markets, limited government, and the resulting constant churning of a dynamic market society, stressing the spontaneous order of a lightly governed society. That's the first element of American conservatism. The next is that American conservatism is about the American founding, which consists in the belief in natural rights. This does not require a theological grounding. Natural rights, as Americans' founders understood it, is just as follows. There are certain rights, the possession of which we know from experience are essential to human flourishing. Expansive freedom, private property, and limited government. Which brings you to a third plank, which is you have to have a government of limited, delegated, and enumerated powers under a written constitution to keep the government in its place. That, to me, is the essence of conservatism, an acceptance of dynamism, a belief in natural rights, and a belief in lightly governed society of spontaneous order by a government of limited, delegated, and enumerated powers.
That sounds very similar to what a lot of my guests have described as classical liberalism. Is there a connection between the two?
Your other guests are quite right. As I say in my book, The Conservative Sensibility, American conservatives are the legatees of classical liberalism that descends from Hobbes, more clearly through Locke, through Americans, particularly Jefferson and Madison, John Stuart Mill, Lord Acton in Britain, Gladstone, and others. Yes, so I cheerfully plead guilty to being a classic liberal. The I'm afraid that the someone once said that when the Americans get done with the English language, it's going to look as though they've been run over by a musical comedy, and it's really too late to straighten out the distinction between conservatism and liberalism, because liberalism in the United States long since quit being what liberalism originally was, which is a defense primarily of liberty. So we conservatives, among ourselves, should know and be have our intellectual history clear enough that we cheerfully confess to being descended from and indeed still allies of the classic liberals.
In your book, you describe in lots of detail how we have a presidential government where Congress has, in a way, given up its powers by allowing all legislation to be done by different administrative agencies in order to be reelected to avoid responsibilities. The result of that is that we have a rampant presidency, which is like which is paired with a hollowed out Congress, and then no one is happy. So, can you explain what you mean, and can you give us some examples?
Where you have efficiently and accurately distilled the essence of my argument about the presidency. The great James Madison was rarely wrong, but he was wrong when he said in the Federalist Papers that all power would be sucked into the legislative vortex. He was worried that the legislature would acquire all power and too much power. It turns out the legislature is all too eager to give up, as you say, responsibility and will cheerfully give up power to the executive branch to avoid responsibility, because giving up responsibility helps many legislators with their primary goal, which is to remain legislators, that is, to protect their incumbency and the offices they hold. Second, however, uh, the scale of government has grown probably 50-fold since we uh, had essentially 535 legislators, 100 senators, 435 congressmen. So they simply don't have time to even know what most of the government is doing. Third, since the Congress wants to stick its 10 thumbs in almost everything, but hasn't the time or the expertise to do so, Congress passes laws that are barely laws. They're really sentiments. We should have uh, a clean environment. We should have a quality education. And then you folks over in the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, or you in the Education Department, write the regulations to turn these sentiments into governing policy. So Congress, out of careerist interests, job security interests, and the sheer press of time, has hollowed itself out. We're constantly hear people complaining presidents are usurping powers. Well, of course they do. I mean, the founders understood that all people in power try to usurp more power. But to say that Congress's powers have been usurped is too kind to Congress. Congress has all too willingly given them up.
Do you think that, so this is kind of related but not related. Do you think that the balance of power that was originally intended in the Constitution before all the amendments and stuff, where it was equally balanced with checks and balances between the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch, do you think that the 17th Amendment, which allows, well, it actually calls for the Senate to be elected by the people directly instead of by the state, do you think that that has a role in changing the balance that there was between the three branches?
I think the 17th Amendment has made matters marginally, but only marginally worse. I regret the 17th Amendment. I liked it better when state legislators selected the senators. It reinforced our federalism, and it gave the senators a political base from which to resist uh, Washington, and particularly Washington executive power. I don't think, however, that the 17th Amendment is primarily responsible for the eclipse of Congress. Much more important have been changes in technology. First, radio. Today we're quite obsessed with new media and new social media, particularly, and the internet and all the rest. That before the internet, there was television. Before television, there was radio, and radio did more, I think, to create the modern presidency uh, than anything else. Radio, uh, not to mention, created the hold of the Nazi Party on Germany. Goebbels, the propaganda minister for the Third Reich, said that simply would have been impossible for them to secure power as swiftly and totally as they did without radio. But radio gave presidents, particularly, a new intimacy with the American people. Television, of course, reinforced this. So the modern means of communication, which has, in a sense, shrunk the country, have enabled presidents to speak directly and constantly to the American people in a way that a committee of 535, which Congress is, simply cannot match.
Hmm. So I heard you quote de Tocqueville in an interview with Matt Welsh at Reason, and you said that he said, quote, historical amnesia is a systemic problem of democracies, end quote. In other words, that we're always looking forward and forgetting the mistakes of the past. So, can you talk to us a little bit about that? And also, how do you reconcile that with criticism by classical liberals that government intervention, political pressure, stuff like that are often aimed at stopping change in the world and preventing creative destruction,
Well,
something that often leads to innovation, as you said.
yes, historical amnesia means we also forget where we've come from. We've forgotten our founding principle. But I do think democracies have a predisposition to believe in change, and that's a good thing. But they also have a tendency to be present minded in the sense that they're concerned with their immediate time horizon, with the immediate desires they have for this or that government benefit or this or that law. I do think it is the case that once government becomes comprehensively intrusive in society, it becomes an enormous buttress for the status quo. The following, let me give you this example. I think Elizabeth Warren, the Democratic progressive senator from Massachusetts, has a firm grip on half a point. She notices that 5 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States by per capita income are in the Washington area. Washington has no natural resources, no manufacturing. We make nothing here but laws and trouble. Why then are we so wealthy? It's because trillions of dollars slosh through the federal government, and factions become organized to engage in what's called rent seeking. That is, trying to bend public power to private advantage, either to confer an advantage on the faction or a disadvantage on competitors to the faction. So factions develop that are articulate, confident, affluent, organized, and well lawyered, and they tend to uh, bend the government to support large entities that already exist, the automobile industry, uh, strong industries that want to benefit from protection against foreign competition. In that sense, intrusive, regulating, administrative state government tends to become captured. Regulatory capture takes place and becomes captured by people who want to preserve the strong. Government becomes not in the sentimental vision of progressives, the friend of the powerless, but indeed, inevitably, it becomes the servant of the strong.
You talked about earlier, you mentioned earlier the importance of having a dynamic economy. And you've noted that Americans don't realize how essential this economic dynamism is to the choice they've made to have an entitlement state through which they've made enormous promises to themselves, to others, of benefits that will be paid to themselves. This promise, you explain, is effectively an enormous call on future productivity. A, I don't know, a statement that there will be dependence on the productivity of the future that is being relied on now, and that means people my age in the future, and that if they want these welfare promises to be paid, then they better attend to that productivity. They better ensure that it's going to happen. Yet your fear is that most people don't understand this dependence, don't understand how much we need dynamism.
That's
So, can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, what worries me is that the American people might be entering what I'll call the great flinch. They're flinching from dynamism. They're deciding that life in a market society with a constant churning and creative destruction in the economy is too stressful, too full of frictions, too wearisome, too tiring. And they've decided that they'd rather pull up the drawbridge, fill the moat with crocodiles, and live in a little castle protected from the forces of the world. My point is, you can't, it's too late for this flinch because Americans, whether or not they know it, and I don't think they do face this fact, have chosen dynamism because of the promises you rightly say we have made through the welfare state. We have made enormous calls on the future productivity of the country, on the future wealth that will be created. So we had jolly well better get busy creating the wealth. And to understand that one of the great social achievements of the 20th century is longevity, the sheer expansion of lifespans. But what that means is that we have constantly aging population. And the welfare state exists primarily to serve the elderly, to transfer wealth from the working young and middle aged to the retired elderly in the form of pensions and medical care. Uh, I mean, it has been said in jest, but there's a lot of truth in the jest that the United States government is an insurance company with a military. Most of what the government does is transfer wealth back and forth and shuffle it around. 67% of the federal budget is transfer payments. And the biggest ones, Medicare and Social Security, transfer wealth to the elderly, who, by the way, vote more regularly and more diligently than other people because the government is more important to them than it is to any other age cohort. And that should interest, to say no more, and actually alarm people in your age group because you're going to work a good part of your life to support the elderly.
So, what is the most effective solution to that? What is the best way, do you think, to kind of change this dependence on our productivity in the future?
I'd love to give you a recipe for that, but I haven't a clue. The demography is destiny for a welfare state. And demography says we have an aging population, and we have a population, young and old alike, who now accept uh, the government's role in providing an ever thickening and ever more generous social safety net. Uh, so, as I say, we just better get very busy uh, providing the wealth that we're going to redistribute through the entitlement state. It seems to me the American people have made a decision, and I'm not going to criticize them for it. Uh, when Barack Obama came into office, there was not a national consensus that everyone should have access to health insurance regardless of any pre existing conditions. When Barack Obama left office 8 years later, there was such a consensus. It's probably the largest achievement of the Obama presidency. Well, we have attached the most rapidly growing portion of our population, the elderly, to one of our most dynamic sciences, medicine, and the result is explosively expensive. The uh, the most rapidly growing age cohort in our population, in percentage terms, is Americans 85 years old or older. The healthcare costs for an 85-year-old on average are 5 times higher than the average healthcare costs for a 55-year-old. Many Medicare patients, I'd say 30 to 40%, are living with two or more chronic ailments, any one of which would have killed them before the age of modern pharmacology. Modern pharmacology is arguably the greatest benefit of the 20th century. But what it means is we're living enormously longer. It's a wonderful thing, as I said, great social achievement, but hugely expensive. Once you decide that people are going to retire at age 65, we set the retirement age at 65 in 1935 when we enacted Social Security. If in 1935 we'd indexed the retirement age to life expectancy, the retirement age in America today would be about 74, and we would have much less of a Social Security problem and probably less of a Medicare problem.
So, kind of changing gears a little bit. Um, in the interview that I spoke of earlier with Matt Welsh, you talk about the economist Frederick Hayek. You talk about his acceptance speech before the Nobel Prize Committee called The Pretense of Knowledge. So, can you tell us about the importance of his speech and its content and how it applies to the world we live in today?
Hayek's great contribution to not just economics, but to political philosophy was to try and alert people to the necessity for what he called epistemic humility. Epistemology is the field of philosophy that tries to understand how we know things, when, how we can confidently say we know this or that. Hayek's point about epistemic humility was this: the more complicated society becomes, the more progressives say government must regulate this complicated thing. Hayek's point is that's exactly wrong. The more complicated society becomes, the more difficult it is for governments to accumulate the information necessary to plan a modern society. After the Second World War, and in part because of the great success we'd had with government mobilizing us for total war, there's great belief in and confidence in economic planning. And Hayek, coming along with his 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, but then in many economic articles and in his great work published, I believe, in 1961 or 2, called The Constitution of Liberty, Hayek said, it's exactly wrong. Every day in every way, we know less and less about the world because there's so much more to know as the world becomes larger and more complicated. And government should understand, first of all, the law of unintended consequences, which is when you have complex systems like a modern society, the unintended consequences of intervention in the workings of this society are apt to be larger than and contrary to the intended consequences. So Hayek was simply saying, stand back, appreciate the creativity of the spontaneous order of a market society of voluntary transactions between free individuals, and let the government facilitate this cooperation between people and not think that it can take its place with top down direction of a complicated society. If there was one thing, aside from my wonderful book, of course, that I wish people your age would read, it's a famous essay by Leonard Read called I, Pencil. His point is no one can make a pencil, the stress being on one. No one person can make a pencil. To make a pencil requires the end of the day, millions of people involved to make a simple pencil. People have to make the wood, they have to mine the graphite, they have to ship the wood, they have to send the wood through the lumber mills. Someone has to make the eraser and the little metal band around the eraser. Someone has to make the coffee and the lunchroom for the manufacturers of these things. Millions of people, it turns out, are involved in making a simple thing like a pencil. And if people could just understand that, we'd be saved a lot of mischief.
Yeah, in an interview that I did a while ago with Matt Ridley, he talked about that and how it takes basically everyone to create stuff, even a pencil, even a computer mouse. And so that's an important concept. Um, so a lot of people call themselves conservatives, but they have very different views from yours and from what I associate with Ronald Reagan's views. Your kind of conservatism favors limited government free markets, but a lot of conservatives today, especially in the media, call for more powerful government and kind of a transition away from free markets. Am I correct in saying that? And if so, why is there such a change?
Uh, the short answer is Donald Trump. Donald Trump tapped into the distress and the dissatisfaction and the anger and the resentments of people who feel they've been left behind by the churning of the modern society, uh, and that they want the government to step in and slow things down and preserve the jobs they had in industries that I'm sorry are just not the industries of the American future. Steel, for example, uh, textiles, for example. So the short answer is that there's a constituency out there of the resentful. And certain younger senators, Josh Hawley, a freshman senator from Missouri, Marco Rubio, I guess in his second term from Florida, have decided to try and create the thinking man's Trumpism. I think that's an oxymoron, but won't dwell on that. Uh, so there is a feeling that there was a Broadway musical some years ago, the title of which was "Stop the World, I Want to Get Off." And I think these conservatives, so-called conservatives, are like this. They want to stop this churning world so we can all get off and put our feet up and be restful and have the same jobs forever. After the Second World War, when the United States was, because of the war, an enormous industrial power, and B, unscathed because of our geographic location, unscathed by the destruction of the war, the United States utterly dominated the world economy. And there was so much security that people would assume you'd graduate from high school or technical school or college, and you'd go to work and you'd work for the same company, IBM or US Steel or Ford Motor Company or General Motors, forever until you retired. Well, we know that that's just not the way it is anymore. You're going to have many different jobs, several different careers, perhaps, in a dynamic society. And longing for the stability of the 1950s is a very destructive and embittering nostalgia.
So, not long ago, I was walking around where I live in Arlington County and I saw this lady. She had a baby and the baby was in a stroller. And on the stroller was it was like a car bumper sticker, but it was on the stroller and it said capitalism kills. I thought it was crazy because she had the newest iPhone, she had a really nice stroller, and she lives in one of the wealthiest country counties in the country. And I couldn't understand how she couldn't see that everything she was holding, everything around her was a product of capitalism, of the system that she denounced. So I've heard you talk about how capitalism itself is soulcraft, that it doesn't just make us better off, that it makes us better. So, can you explain what you mean? Because this is very lost on a lot of people, and I think it's a really important concept.
I'm sure that woman who has turned her baby into a rolling billboard against capitalism, she probably has in her pocket or in her purse
Probably.
an Apple iPhone, and she probably has an Apple computer at home, and she probably thinks government somehow produced this. She doesn't realize that Apple started in Steve Jobs' garage. Uh, she that people have no idea how the world works, where things come from. Uh, she has no idea that between uh, the invention of agriculture about 10,000 years ago and the late 18th century, there was essentially no economic growth. Economic growth is a modern phenomenon driven entirely by changed attitudes about self interested behavior. There's a wonderful series of books written by Deidre McCloskey on the bourgeois virtues. And she says this idea started really in the Netherlands, in Holland, that being entrepreneurial was not a vice, it was not sordid, it was good for everybody. And that sort of leapt the English Channel, got to Britain, where Mr. Watt invented the steam engine. We learned how to turn heat into motion. And boom, what followed is what Deidre McCloskey calls the Great Enrichment. Just in my lifetime, I'm 79, in my lifetime, the percentage of the world population living in severe poverty, that is, on subsistence wages, the percentage of the population living in severe poverty has declined from 50% to 9%. That is entirely the result of capitalism and respect for markets and the rational allocation of wealth and opportunity as opposed to state power.
So now I kind of want to move to your love of baseball, which is a very well known thing. You've written many books about it. Well, two, I think. But one of them is called Men at Work. I know that in the book you draw analogies between baseball and civic life and politics. So, how is baseball like life, and what lessons can we learn from it?
Well, baseball is a good sport for a democracy because democracy is the system of the half loaf. No one gets everything they want in democracy. There's a lot of losing in democracy. Lord knows my side loses all the time. Uh, and same is true in baseball. Uh, every team goes to spring training thinking they're going to win 60 games and they're going to lose 60 games. And they play the whole season to sort out the middle 42 games. If a baseball team wins 10 out of 20 every 20 games, it's definitionally mediocre. If it wins 11 out of 20 games, it's going to win 87, 88 games, and it might play in the postseason. So there's a lot of losing in baseball. There's a lot of losing and compromise in democracy. So baseball is good training for democratic citizenship. It's a grinding meritocracy, 162 game season. At the end of the season, you are what your record says you are. You can't say, "Oh, gee whiz, I'm really better than this." No, no, your record tells you what you are after 162 games.
Hmm. That, I mean, that kind of seems like that seems like America. I feel like that makes sense. Um,
I hope so.
so finally, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Well, in matter of public policy, I didn't used to believe in term limits for national legislatures. I now do. I understand that there are costs to that. You lose some institutional memory by a constant churning, but I think careerism uh, is a bigger threat than the loss of institutional memory. So I'm now for term limits. In fact, I feel strongly enough about it that I wrote an entire book on the subject called Restoration, Congress, Term Limits, and the Recovery of Deliberative Democracy. I did not used to be in favor of a balanced budget constitutional amendment. I didn't see how to draft one, and I hesitated to constitutionalize fiscal policy. But again, I just think the dynamics of democracy make this necessary, and there are some very wise people have worked on I think, a very workable constitutional amendment. Uh, so those are two matters of public policy on which I've changed my mind. I think what worries me most today, and it's a new worry, so in a sense, this is a change of mind, that one of America's biggest problems is that our intelligentsia is so unintelligent. By intelligentsia, I mean those who think of themselves as intellectuals or as intellectually inclined. And so many of those who today in America think of themselves that way are strikingly badly educated and incompetent thinkers. And so that's what worries me, is that we have a real intellectual should be immune to intellectual fads and hysterias. Our intelligentsia seems singularly susceptible to fads and hysterias. It's very depressing.
I've seen that. I've noticed that. But, I mean, the best we can do is hope. Thank you so much for talking to me today and for taking the time to talk to me. It has been truly an honor to have you on my podcast. I hope that your fight for the restoration of true conservatism and, I don't know, a change in the intellectual stability, I guess you could say, will gain traction, especially with my generation, and that you will win this battle.
Well,
I honestly think that it's a fight that we can't afford to lose, that my generation can't afford to lose.
well, I'm glad to pitch in on your podcast, which I think will help in this struggle.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on.
Of course.